What happens when one carefully worded question on a live daytime talk show unexpectedly turns into the kind of moment that leaves an entire studio frozen in silence? What happens when one of Hollywood's brightest young stars refuses to smile through an uncomfortable exchange and instead responds with calm confidence that no one in the room saw coming? Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to Prime Spotlight, like this video, and comment below with your thoughts, because today's story is a dramatic television moment that fans won't soon forget. The studio lights glowed brighter than usual as the audience settled into their seats, their conversations blending into the familiar excitement that always filled the room before the cameras began rolling. Producers hurried behind the scenes, checking headsets, reviewing cue cards, and counting down the final seconds before the broadcast. The atmosphere felt energetic, but beneath the polished television routine, there was an unspoken anticipation that something memorable was about to unfold. Zendaya had appeared on countless interviews throughout her career. She had built a reputation for grace under pressure, carefully choosing her words while remaining authentic. Whether discussing blockbuster films, fashion, or charitable work, she rarely allowed herself to be pulled into unnecessary controversy. That calm presence had become part of her public identity. As she stepped onto the stage, the audience erupted into warm applause. She smiled politely, waving as she crossed toward the panel. Joy Behar greeted her with a friendly grin. "It's always nice to have you here." "Thank you," Zendaya replied warmly. "It's always great to be back." The opening minutes moved exactly as everyone expected. They discussed recent projects. They laughed about long filming schedules. The audience chuckled as Zendaya shared stories about exhausting overnight shoots and learning unexpected skills while preparing for demanding roles. The conversation flowed naturally. Even the producers watching from the control room relaxed. Everything seemed perfectly on track. Then the discussion shifted. One producer quietly leaned toward another behind the monitors. "This is the segment." A different graphic appeared on the studio screens. The conversation moved away from entertainment and toward a broader discussion about public expectations placed on celebrities. Joy leaned slightly forward. "You've become someone that so many young people look up to," she began thoughtfully. "People watch everything you say, everything you wear, every opinion you express." Zendaya nodded. "I understand that." Joy continued. "But some people argue celebrities today are expected to comment on almost everything happening in society." Another host added gently. "Sometimes people criticize public figures for speaking. And sometimes," Joy interrupted, "they criticize them for staying quiet." The audience murmured softly. Zendaya maintained her composed smile. "I think that's true." Joy folded her hands together. "So here's something I've always wondered." The room grew noticeably quieter. "When you choose not to respond publicly to certain controversial topics, do you ever worry people see that as avoiding difficult conversations?" The audience leaned in. It wasn't an aggressive question. "Not yet," Zendaya answered calmly. "I think every situation deserves careful thought." Joy nodded. "But isn't silence also a message?" A few audience members exchanged uncertain glances. Zendaya paused before answering. "It can be." Joy smiled politely. "So then how do people know the difference?" The cameras slowly pushed closer. Zendaya inhaled quietly. "I think people sometimes assume that because someone isn't speaking publicly, they're not thinking privately." Joy tilted her head. "But your platform is enormous." "It is. So don't you feel an obligation?" There was nothing hostile in Joy's voice, but there was unmistakable persistence. Zendaya remained composed. "I feel a responsibility." Joy immediately followed. "Is that different from an obligation?" The audience laughed nervously. Zendaya smiled. "It depends how you define those words." Joy leaned back slightly. "Fair enough." For a brief second, it seemed the conversation might move elsewhere. Instead, Joy looked down at her notes. "I've seen people online say younger celebrities are very careful with their public image." Another host shifted uncomfortably. Joy continued. "They wonder whether that caution sometimes gets mistaken for authenticity." A quiet ripple spread across the audience. Zendaya's expression changed ever so slightly. Not anger, not frustration, simply focus. She answered slowly. "I think authenticity doesn't always look loud." The audience applauded. Joy acknowledged the applause before continuing. "But if you're always careful." She paused. "How do people know they're seeing the real you?" Silence. Even backstage, production assistants stopped moving. Zendaya looked directly toward Joy. The real me isn't measured by how quickly I answer difficult questions. The audience clapped again. Joy smiled. I'm not questioning your sincerity. I know, but people watching might. Zendaya nodded. And they're entitled to their opinions. Joy looked intrigued. So that doesn't bother you? It used to. Joy raised an eyebrow. And now? Zendaya smiled softly. I've realized something. The audience waited. You can't spend your life trying to become everyone's version of yourself. Applause echoed through the studio. One audience member even stood briefly before sitting again. Joy smiled politely. That's a good line. Zendaya laughed. It's also true. The atmosphere softened. For a moment. Then another host introduced a different perspective. Social media has changed everything. Zendaya nodded. It has. People expect immediate reactions. They do. Sometimes within minutes. Zendaya smiled knowingly. I've noticed. Laughter spread through the audience. Joy returned to the discussion. But doesn't waiting sometimes allow other people to define your position? Zendaya answered thoughtfully. Only if you allow them to. Joy looked unconvinced. But perception becomes reality. Zendaya shook her head gently. I don't believe that. Joy responded almost instantly. You don't? No. Why not? Because perception changes. The audience became completely silent again. Character, Zendaya continued, takes much longer to build. A wave of applause followed. Joy smiled. But television moves fast. So does social media. So does public opinion. Zendaya nodded. Exactly. Joy leaned forward one more time. And that's why I'm asking. The room seemed to shrink. If millions of people misunderstand you. She paused carefully. Isn't it your responsibility to correct them? The audience stopped applauding. Stopped whispering. Stopped moving altogether. Zendaya's smile disappeared. Not because she was offended. Because she had reached the point where every word mattered. She folded her hands calmly. Looked directly across the table. Then answered with a firmness that surprised everyone watching. My responsibility isn't to chase every misunderstanding. The audience froze. It's to live consistently enough that the truth eventually speaks louder than the assumptions. Absolute silence. Even the hosts looked momentarily caught off guard. Joy blinked once. Then smiled politely. That's an interesting answer. But something had shifted. The easy rhythm that had carried the interview through its opening moments was gone. Everyone in the studio could feel it. The conversation had crossed an invisible line. What had begun as a thoughtful discussion was becoming something far more personal. Behind the cameras, producers exchanged uneasy glances. One quietly whispered into a headset. Stay with this. No one wanted to interrupt. No one wanted to cut to commercial. Because everyone sensed the same thing. The most unforgettable part of this conversation had only just begun. The silence that followed seemed to stretch far longer than it actually did. In reality, it lasted only a few seconds. But inside the studio, those seconds carried the weight of an entire conversation that had suddenly become much more than another celebrity interview. Every camera remained fixed on the table. Every producer behind the glass watched the monitors without saying a word. Even the audience, who had laughed comfortably just moments before, now sat completely still, waiting to see who would speak first. Joy Behar broke the silence with a measured smile. I appreciate that answer, she said. I really do. Zendaya nodded politely. But, Joy continued, there's another side to it. The audience shifted in their seats. Joy rested one hand on the table. When millions of people admire you, some would argue you don't really get to decide when your words matter. They matter whether you choose them or not. Zendaya listened without interrupting. I understand why people feel that way, she replied. So do you disagree? I think it's more complicated. Joy leaned forward slightly. How? Zendaya took a slow breath before answering. I think people sometimes confuse having influence with owing everyone immediate access to your thoughts. The audience responded with soft applause. Joy smiled politely but wasn't ready to move on. But isn't that exactly what being a public figure means? It means people are interested. And it doesn't mean they own every piece of me. A louder round of applause filled the room. Joy waited until the audience settled. I don't think anyone's saying they own you. No, Zendaya answered calmly. But sometimes expectations can feel that way. Another host stepped in, hoping to broaden the discussion. I think what Joy is asking is whether public figures carry a unique responsibility during difficult moments. Zendaya turned toward her with a warm expression. I believe everyone carries responsibility. Not equally, though. No. So celebrities have more? They have more visibility. And visibility creates responsibility. It creates opportunity. Joy immediately followed. But opportunity can become obligation. Zendaya smiled slightly. Only if you let other people define your purpose. Several audience members exchanged impressed looks. The discussion was no longer tense because voices were rising. It was tense because neither woman was backing away. Every answer invited another question. Every response uncovered another layer. Backstage, the floor manager quietly reminded everyone through the headset that the segment was already running longer than planned. The producer answered without taking his eyes off the monitor. Keep rolling. One camera slowly zoomed closer to Zendaya. She remained composed, her posture relaxed, her hands folded comfortably in front of her. There was no sign of frustration, only careful concentration. Joy noticed it too. You always seem incredibly calm. Zendaya laughed softly. I don't always feel calm. The audience laughed with her. So what are you feeling right now? Joy asked. The question landed differently. It wasn't about public responsibility anymore. It was personal. Zendaya paused. I'm thinking about how easy it is for conversations to become competitions. Joy raised an eyebrow. You think this is a competition? No. What then? I think conversations work best when nobody feels like they have to win. The audience applauded again. Joy smiled. I agree. But another smile crossed Zendaya's face. I knew there was another, but the audience burst into laughter. Joy laughed too. Fair enough. Then her expression became serious again. You've spoken many times about protecting your peace. I have. Some critics hear that phrase and think it's become a way for celebrities to avoid uncomfortable discussions. The room grew quiet again. Zendaya looked toward the audience before answering. I've heard that criticism. So, I don't believe protecting your peace means avoiding discomfort. What does it mean? It means deciding which conversations deserve your energy. Joy tilted her head. And who decides that? I do. Joy answered immediately. Some people would say that's convenient. Zendaya's smile faded, not with anger, but with resolve. It would be convenient if I never had difficult conversations. The audience listened carefully. I've had plenty. Joy nodded. Publicly? Some. And privately? Many more. Joy folded her arms gently. But the public only sees one version. Exactly. So how can they judge fairly? They can't. Another brief silence settled across the studio. One audience member whispered something to the person beside her, who nodded without taking her eyes off the stage. The discussion had become strangely intimate. Nobody was shouting. Nobody was interrupting. Yet every sentence seemed heavier than the last. Joy leaned back for the first time since the conversation had begun. I've been doing television for a long time. I know. I've interviewed thousands of people. I believe it. And I've learned that sometimes the most revealing answers aren't the answers people give. Zendaya looked curious. They're the answers people don't. A few audience members quietly murmured. Zendaya considered the statement. Then she replied with a calm certainty that immediately drew attention. I've learned something different. Joy waited. The questions people choose to ask often reveal just as much. The audience reacted with a mix of applause and surprised laughter. Even one of the other hosts smiled at the exchange. Joy gave a small nod. Touché. For the first time since the discussion had turned serious, both women shared a brief laugh. The tension eased, but only for a moment. The producer glanced at the rundown. They were supposed to move to a lighter topic. Instead, he quietly removed the commercial cue. Nobody wanted to interrupt what was unfolding. Joy looked down at one final card resting on the table. I almost skipped this question. Zendaya noticed the hesitation. But, Joy smiled. You've probably figured out that's not really my style. The audience laughed. Joy continued. There are people who believe today's celebrities spend too much time managing perception instead of simply speaking honestly. Zendaya nodded. I've heard that too. Does it bother you personally? She answered without hesitation. No. Joy looked surprised. No. Why not? Because I can't control what strangers imagine about me. Joy asked quietly. So what can you control? Zendaya looked directly at her. My integrity. The audience erupted into applause louder than at any point so far. Some people stood. Others simply clapped harder. The energy inside the room shifted once again. Not because anyone had declared a winner, but because the conversation had reached a place where every person watching seemed to recognize something genuine beneath the debate. Joy waited for the applause to settle before speaking again. You've answered every question carefully. I've tried, but let me ask one more. Zendaya nodded. I'm listening. Joy looked her directly in the eye. If you knew one honest answer could disappoint half the people who admire you. The room fell silent once more. Would you still give it? Zendaya didn't look away. She didn't hesitate. She simply smiled, a small, confident smile that carried none of the uncertainty people expected. Then she answered in a voice so steady that every microphone in the studio seemed to capture not just her words, but the conviction behind them. If honesty disappoints someone, I can live with that. The audience remained completely still. What I couldn't live with, she paused, is pretending to be someone else just to avoid disappointing them. A wave of applause thundered across the studio. Several audience members rose to their feet. The hosts exchanged quick glances. Joy's expression softened. For the first time all afternoon, she didn't immediately follow with another question. Instead, she simply looked across the table, realizing the discussion had grown into something far more meaningful than anyone had anticipated. And yet, despite the applause and the momentary calm, another difficult question was already waiting. One that would push the conversation beyond thoughtful disagreement, and into a confrontation that neither the audience nor the hosts would be prepared for. The applause finally began to fade, but the energy in the studio had transformed into something electric. Audience members slowly returned to their seats, exchanging glances that said everything words couldn't. They had witnessed something genuine, something that transcended the typical daytime television formula. The conversation between Zendaya and Joy Behar had moved beyond entertainment into something far more significant. Joy Behar sat quietly for a moment, her usual quick wit momentarily set aside. She studied Zendaya with a mixture of professional respect and personal curiosity. The other hosts shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to jump in or let the moment breathe. Behind the cameras, producers watched the monitors with renewed focus, recognizing that whatever happened next would determine whether this segment became legendary or simply memorable. Zendaya's composure remained unshaken. She had answered every question with thoughtfulness and grace, never raising her voice, never showing frustration. But the cameras captured something subtle in her eyes, a quiet readiness that suggested she understood the conversation wasn't finished yet. Joy finally broke the silence with a different tone, softer than before. I've interviewed a lot of people who give beautiful answers. Zendaya smiled politely. Thank you. But I've learned something over the years. The audience leaned forward almost imperceptibly. Joy continued. Beautiful answers don't always come from honest places. The statement hung in the air like a challenge wrapped in observation. Zendaya nodded slowly, acknowledging the point without accepting the implication. That's true. So how do we know the difference? The question landed gently, but its weight was unmistakable. Zendaya considered it carefully before responding. I think you feel it. Joy raised an eyebrow. Feel it? Yeah. Explain that. Zendaya leaned forward slightly, her voice carrying a sincerity that silenced any lingering whispers in the audience. People who are performing honesty usually can't sustain it. Joy waited. They have a script in their head. They know what they want to say. They've practiced it. But when you push beyond the script, when you ask something they didn't prepare for, something shifts. The audience watched with rapt attention. Zendaya continued. Their eyes change. Their breathing changes. They reach for the same phrases again and again. Joy smiled thoughtfully. And when you watch someone who's genuinely honest, Zendaya answered without hesitation. They don't always sound perfect. A murmur of agreement spread through the audience. They sometimes stumble. They sometimes pause because they're thinking, not because they're calculating. They sometimes admit they don't have the answer yet. Joy nodded. And you think people can see that? Zendaya shrugged gently. I think people can feel it, even if they can't explain why. One of the other hosts, who had been quiet for most of the exchange, finally spoke up. That's a beautiful way to put it. Zendaya turned toward her with a warm expression. Thank you. But, the host continued carefully, doesn't that also mean you're always aware of how you're being perceived? The question shifted the conversation slightly, introducing a new layer of complexity. Zendaya considered it thoughtfully. I think awareness and performance are different things. Explain. Being aware of how you're perceived doesn't mean you're performing. It means you're paying attention. It means you understand that your words have impact. Joy re-entered the conversation. But where's the line? Zendaya met her gaze directly. The line is whether you're choosing your words to express yourself or to manage someone else's opinion of you. The audience applauded again, though more softly this time. The conversation seemed to be reaching a natural rhythm, a thoughtful exploration rather than a confrontation. But beneath the surface, tension still simmered. Joy glanced at her notes, then back at Zendaya. You said something earlier that I've been thinking about. Zendaya tilted her head slightly. You said authenticity doesn't always look loud. I did. Can you explain what you meant by that? Zendaya took a breath before answering. I think we live in a culture that equates volume with sincerity. The audience listened intently. Someone who speaks loudly, who dominates conversations, who always has an opinion ready, we tend to assume they're being honest. Joy nodded. And you disagree? I think honesty sometimes requires quiet. The room fell silent. Zendaya continued. Sometimes the most honest thing you can do is admit you're still figuring things out. Sometimes the most authentic response is, I don't know. Joy considered the words carefully. But that's not what people want to hear. I know. And that doesn't bother you? Zendaya smiled gently. It used to. Used to. I spent years thinking I needed to have answers for everything. That I needed to sound certain and confident and completely sure of every position I took. The audience leaned in. And then I realized something. Joy waited expectantly. The people I admire most are the ones who are honest about uncertainty. The statement landed with surprising power. Joy processed it carefully. So you're saying uncertainty itself can be a form of honesty? Zendaya nodded. Absolutely. Pretending to have all the answers isn't authenticity. It's performance. Another host interjected carefully. But doesn't that create a problem? If people hear you say, I don't know about something important, don't they question your authority? Zendaya answered without hesitation. Sometimes. But I think authority built on pretending isn't real authority anyway. The audience erupted into applause again, longer this time. Joy watched the reaction carefully. Her expression betrayed nothing, but behind her eyes, something was shifting. She had been pushing, probing, testing. And Zendaya had responded with a patience and thoughtfulness that was increasingly rare in public discourse. But Joy wasn't finished. She had one more angle to explore. You mentioned your family earlier. Zendaya nodded cautiously. You grew up with parents who supported your career from a very young age. I did. They've been incredible. So you had people in your corner. Zendaya paused. Yes. That must make a difference. It does. Joy tilted her head slightly. But not everyone has that. Zendaya nodded slowly, sensing where the conversation was headed. I know. Have you ever thought about how your experience might make it easier for you to talk about integrity and boundaries? The question was carefully worded, but carried significant weight. Zendaya considered it seriously before answering. Absolutely. I think about it all the time. Joy leaned forward. So when you talk about protecting your peace or having boundaries. Yes. Do you ever worry that sounds like privilege? The room grew quiet again. Zendaya's expression softened thoughtfully. I think it can sound like privilege to people who haven't had the opportunity to build those boundaries. Joy nodded. And I think that's something I have to be aware of. The audience listened closely. Zendaya continued. I was fortunate to have parents who taught me early that I had value beyond my career. That I didn't need to please everyone. That my worth wasn't measured by public approval. Joy's voice was careful. Not everyone gets that lesson. Zendaya nodded. I know. So when you speak about boundaries so confidently. Joy paused. Do you ever think about the people who don't have the luxury of saying no? The question landed differently than any other in the conversation. It wasn't confrontational, but it was deeply challenging. Zendaya was quiet for a moment. Not because she was avoiding the question, but because she was genuinely considering it. The cameras captured every subtle shift in her expression. I think about it all the time. You do? Yes. Why? Zendaya looked directly at Joy. Because I know I'm privileged. And I think privilege comes with responsibility. Joy nodded slowly. What kind of responsibility? The responsibility to use whatever platform I have to speak about things that matter. Not just for myself, but for people who don't have the same opportunities. The audience applauded again. Joy smiled politely but continued. But you also said you don't feel obligated to comment on everything. I don't. Those two things seem connected. They are. Zendaya paused before continuing. You can feel responsible without being reactive. Joy looked intrigued. Explain. Responsibility means thinking carefully before speaking. It means choosing your moments. It means understanding that not every issue requires your voice, but the issues you do speak about deserve genuine thought. The audience murmured in agreement. Joy leaned back slightly. So you're careful not because you're afraid. Exactly. Then why? Zendaya answered simply. Because I respect my audience enough not to waste their time with shallow opinions. The studio erupted in applause once again. Joy glanced at the other hosts, then back at Zendaya. I have to say, you're very good at this. Zendaya laughed softly. Thank you. I mean it. I appreciate that. Joy folded her hands on the table. I've asked a lot of questions. You have. And you've answered all of them. I've tried. Joy smiled. A genuine smile that seemed to acknowledge the depth of the conversation. But I have one more. Zendaya nodded calmly. I'm ready. Joy's expression became serious. I want to ask you something I've never asked anyone before. The room grew completely silent. Even the producers behind the glass stopped moving. Zendaya didn't look away. Go ahead. Joy took a breath. You've talked about boundaries, about protecting your peace, about being careful about which conversations deserve your energy. Zendaya waited. But I wonder. Joy paused. If there are conversations you avoid because you're afraid of what might happen if you engage with them. The question was simple, but its implications were enormous. Zendaya's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not with anger, not with defensiveness, but with something that looked remarkably like recognition. She had been waiting for this question, and when she finally answered, her response would change everything. The audience held their breath. The cameras held their focus. And Zendaya spoke with a clarity that would echo through the studio long after the broadcast ended. The silence that followed Joy's question was unlike anything the studio had experienced. It wasn't discomfort. It was recognition, the understanding that something deeply personal was about to be shared. Zendaya's eyes remained fixed on Joy, her expression softened in a way that suggested she was no longer speaking to a television host. She was speaking to someone who had just asked a question that deserved genuine honesty. That's a really good question, Zendaya finally said. And I think the honest answer is yes. Joy leaned forward with genuine curiosity. Can you tell me more about that? Zendaya took a breath. I think everyone has conversations they avoid. Not because they're scared of the topic itself, but because they're scared of what engaging with it might reveal about themselves. The audience listened with complete attention. I've avoided conversations before because I knew that if I really engaged with them, I might have to confront something uncomfortable about myself. Conversations around identity, around race, around what it means to be a young Black woman in Hollywood who's been told her entire career that she needs to be palatable. Joy nodded. And you avoided those? Sometimes. Not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I knew that if I opened that door, I might not be able to close it again. And I wasn't always ready for that. Joy's voice was gentle. Do you think that's changed? Zendaya smiled softly. I think I stopped being afraid of disappointing people who were never really on my side anyway. For a long time, I tried to be everything to everyone. I wanted to be admired. I wanted to be respected. I wanted to be loved. And I thought that meant never saying anything that might upset anyone. Joy listened intently. And then I realized that people who truly respect you don't need you to agree with them all the time. The people who genuinely care about you can handle disagreement. They can handle complexity. They can handle you being a real person with real thoughts and real doubts. The audience applauded warmly. Joy sat back, processing everything. The conversation had evolved into something rare, a genuine dialogue between two women who respected each other enough to be honest. I have to be honest with you, Joy said. When we planned this segment, most questions were designed to push you a little. Zendaya laughed. I've done enough interviews to recognize when someone's trying to get a reaction. And you still came? I like challenges. The studio erupted in laughter. Joy's expression became thoughtful again. What do you wish people understood about you that they don't? Zendaya was quiet for a long moment. I wish people understood that I'm still figuring it out. I'm 29 years old. I've accomplished things I never dreamed possible. But I still wake up some days feeling like I don't know what I'm doing. I still have doubts. I still have fears. I still make mistakes. Joy's voice was soft. And you want people to know that? I want people to know that success doesn't mean you have all the answers. It means you keep showing up anyway. Zendaya looked directly at the audience. I've been asked a lot of questions today. Some were difficult. Some made me think. And I'm grateful for that. But I want to say something that doesn't get said enough. The people watching, they're facing their own difficult conversations every day. Sometimes they don't have a platform to respond. They're just trying to navigate their lives the best they can. And I want them to know that their struggles matter too. Their questions matter too. Their doubts matter too. The entire studio rose to their feet, applauding not just Zendaya's words, but the sincerity behind them. Joy spoke with admiration. I've interviewed hundreds of people who were careful, thoughtful, and articulate. But I've rarely interviewed someone who could handle tough questions the way you just did. You answered every question with honesty and grace. Zendaya nodded appreciatively. Thank you. That means a lot. Joy smiled. If you could say anything to the people watching, anything at all, what would it be? Zendaya considered carefully. I'd say this, your voice matters. Not because you're famous or powerful. Your voice matters because you're human. Don't let anyone make you feel like your thoughts don't count. The conversations that change things happen because ordinary people refuse to stay silent. The applause was deafening. Backstage, Joy approached Zendaya. I've learned to recognize when someone is performing and when someone is being real. You're real. Zendaya smiled softly. That means more than you know. As Zendaya walked toward the exit, she felt a quiet sense of peace. She had been challenged. She had been pushed. But she had also been seen. She had shown vulnerability without losing strength. She had proven that integrity wasn't about having perfect answers. It was about showing up authentically, even when it was hard. The broadcast ended. The audience went home. But the conversation would continue in the hearts of everyone who had witnessed it. Because some moments transcend television. Some moments become part of something larger. And this unforgettable exchange had become exactly that. What did you think of this powerful moment? If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to Prime Spotlight for more unforgettable celebrity moments. Like this video if you believe authenticity matters, and comment below with your favorite moment from this interview. Did Zendaya handle the tough questions with grace? Share your thoughts, and let's continue this important conversation together.